Good morning and welcome to the 13th annual NetPoint GPM Conference. We're glad that you are choosing to join us for this keynote presentation, and we're hoping that you'll have a chance to join some of the other presentations. Here's a schedule for today and tomorrow morning. As you know, this is the one conference that features the graphical path method of planning and scheduling, GPM. GPM, of course, is the teenage alternative, the 14-year-old method counterpart to grand old 66-year-old CPM. In this conference, our GPM community shares their experiences with our software, lessons learned, and we get to unveil our most recent innovations, like typically Ponce shows us our latest software innovation, and Dr. Vivek and I will showcase what latest algorithms we've been working on, and we do some training. So today, Dr. Vivek and I are choosing to talk about safe float. We're doing this because recently we have added the algorithms for safe float to our net risk software. So it's time for us to remind you of how to use Monte Carlo simulation to help us with our schedules. So let me advance to the abstract of the presentation. I am sure that most of you joining us today are not only familiar with schedule risk assessment, but you do it on your projects from time to time, maybe frequently. Well, if you're doing CPM, schedule risk assessment, we're here to tell you that you're leaving something on the table. In particular, you're not modeling float use, the risk of using float when you do your simulations. And what are the consequences of that? You are missing the opportunity to get more than just one p-value curve, and you are missing the chance to calculate a counterpart to total float that would be very helpful for your schedules when you go back to managing your normal schedule. So foundationally, let's make sure that we are all together on total float. This is pretty much the standard definition. You have a schedule, you have late dates, you have total floats. The idea is that if you delay an activity within its total float, you're not going to cause an impact to the project completion date. That's the basic belief or assumption that we have when we use total float. Because I'm trying to improve on total float, I now have to have a caveat. In reality, total float, whatever total float you have, is based on one duration scenario. But because durations are inherently uncertain, then you are calculating total float without considering uncertainty. And that creates an Achilles heel that can be remedied. And we're hoping to show you that today. Fundamentally, we want to talk about total float and its contribution, its impact on our ability to predict project completion. And we're focusing on this because, regrettably, we're not doing too well. Every couple of years, some entity conducts a survey. How are we doing with the schedule performance? Here's an example. Most construction projects are over budget and late. A new survey finds budget and schedule overruns are the norm for more than 3/4 of construction projects. I mean, that's just staggering. I mean, this is 2021, 22, whenever. And it just goes on. 9 out of 10 do not finish construction projects in time, and so on and so forth. So all of those studies have a myriad of reasons that are contributing to poor schedule performance. Today, Dr. Vivek and I are focusing on total float and how total float, while it may be helpful to managing your schedules day in and day out, is not a helpful concept as it relates to truly timely completion, your ability to predict and come through on timely completion. The first predicate of total float is that you have a scheduled finish date. That date is achievable. How do we do that? So you have a schedule, you do a forward pass, right? Then you have a scheduled finish date. Then you pivot around and you complete, you backward pass your late dates. You might start from that scheduled finish date, you might push it back a little bit later or earlier. But the bottom line is that date, why would you believe on total float if you didn't believe that the date was achievable, right? The second predicate is that a delay within total float will not extend the project. It's a safe delay. But that has some big assumptions. You have one scenario of durations. You have 2,000 activities, one scenario of literally millions. So to talk about safety and delay with one scenario is pretty chancy. Brian, let's do the poll at this time.
Okay, the poll's been launched. Give everyone about 10 to 15 seconds to provide their answer. All right, so now we're going to end the poll and share the results.
Well, actually, we have a fairly enlightened audience, because the majority, by a small margin, but still, over half of the people with us today think under 50%, which is really, we're going to see pretty much the case. But a lot of us today think it's 50-50 chance. I have about 20-some projects that we conducted a risk assessment. These are projects of the last 6-7 years. And in each instance, of course, we have a base case schedule that was simulated. If I might direct your attention to the second column from the right. The first project, the base case completion date is August 30th, 2028. The second project of all things, we have Christmas Eve completion date and so on. Now, if I go to the rightmost column, we risk assess all of these schedules. So we were able to calculate the probability of completing the project by that scheduled finish date. And as you can see, it's negligible. Nearly half these projects don't even have a single-digit probability of completing by that date. In fact, out of these projects, only 10% of them even have a 50-50 chance of completing by that deterministic completion date. So the predicate that we use for total float, it's unrealistic. But the picture is grimmer than that, because those probabilities were all based using a CPM simulation. That means in every iteration, no activity was ever floated from its early dates. If you did 5,000 iterations, if you have 500 activities, every one of them, every instance on the early date, float was never used. If you do a simulation of a fundamentally stochastic model, your network, without ever floating activities, you're massively overestimating your likelihood of completion. Now, here's the thing. If you were to use your schedule to model cost, to model manpower, we know very well that you can get a variety of distributions. If every activity starts on its early date, you get an upper bound on an envelope of possibilities, the green curve. On the other hand, if every activity starts on the late date, then you get a lower bound curve on your envelope. And presumably, your project will unfold somewhere in between. Now, notice that in this curve, both curves finish at exactly the same time. Because on both curves, you are always using the one duration, whether it's the early schedule or the late schedule, you have the one duration you're using. But when you accept randomness, when you accept variability, it's not necessarily true that an activity will last the same if you do it at different times. That's the glitch, that's the catch. Now, what about schedule risk analyses? Well, if you do a CPM simulation, all you get is one curve. If I may ask, which is it? Is it the early? Is it the late? Well, it is just the early curve. However, were you to perform a GPM simulation, then you not just get an envelope. You can get a variety of curves based on how you model float use. And here's kind of how this is not helping us. If I wanted to target a completion for my project, that 80% likelihood, I'm looking at the schedule here, October 8th. But that means that every activity will happen exactly on the early date. If I accept the fact that I'm using total float, let's say I use all the total float, well, an 80 probability completion is a month later. In fact, my targeted completion date that I think is 80% likely, if I use any kind of float, maybe 50% likely. And if I use a lot of the float, which normally is the case, it's hardly likely at all. So it's kind of a very optimistic start when you do a simulation without modeling float. Now, let's go back to total float. If I'm trying, by the way, I'm not trying to dump on total float here. I'm just trying to figure out what is it about it that I could improve so that I can improve my chances of completing on time, because as I said, we're not doing very well. Now, the basic premise is activity durations are uncertain. Fact of the matter, if we didn't believe that, well, why the heck would you simulate a schedule, right? Why would you risk assess schedules if durations are not uncertain? So the thing about total float, though, total float is a lagging indicator. What does that mean? Let's say you have an activity that lasts 60 days and it's got 40 days of total float. You decide, well, I'll put it off for 30 days. You come back 30 days later, well, shoot, maybe access to your area of the project has been hampered somehow. Maybe different weather window, maybe the crew that you have is not the crew that you originally, or maybe you just blew the duration. Maybe it really wasn't even 60 days to begin with, just out of an error. So you use total float, you're assuming that the duration that you had is going to be the same when you get to it. Well, it may or may not. And then some, if every activity in your schedule was underestimated, if every activity was exactly right on what's going to happen or overestimated, at least total float would be a bias metric, but it was constant. But the reality is, out of 5,000 activities or out of 300 activities, some durations will be underestimated, some overestimated. So, anytime you underestimate durations, you overestimate total float. Every time you overestimate durations, you undervalue total float. And you never know until the project unfolds. And the impact of using total float earlier on your project or later on is vastly different. Using 5 days of total float early in your project has a lot of impact because there's a lot of uncertainty remaining. As the clock moves, as the data advances, uncertainty it becomes history. You have less uncertainty because you have less work to proceed. So the moral to the story is, it is better off if you have a conventional schedule, better off to use less total float early on, and then to have the opportunity to have more realistic values as your project unfolds. So what we're proposing is that if you do a schedule risk assessment and you want to improve on your results, that you do a GPM schedule risk assessment, because we have now added the safe flow algorithms into net risk. And here's what we're proposing. Rather than simulating a schedule and reverting back to just using total flows, why not take with you useful information that is otherwise available from a GPM schedule risk assessment? We call that measure safe flow. Mind you, we didn't make that up. That term was introduced in 1995. But we are basically giving you a simulation, a statistical solution to the theory that was proposed in 1995. And it is truly safe because it considers all duration scenarios. And furthermore, rather than pivoting on a completion date that is unlikely and unknown, you're going to target a completion date with the probability you want based on your risk appetite. At this point in time, Dr. Vivek is going to show us the theory, some examples, some conclusions, how to use safe flow. Dr. Vivek?
Thank you, Dr. Gee. Yeah, let me just share my screen. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining in. And thank you, Dr. Gee, for that introduction to safe float. And I will over here talk more about how safe float can be calculated, how we can use it in our decision-making process. And again, like Dr. Gee mentioned earlier, well, if you're doing a simple risk analysis using net risk, if you were doing that same analysis, there is no additional effort needed in getting these safe floats. So basically, not using it doesn't make sense at that point. Okay, so let me start off with two questions. First question over here, you have a deterministic schedule with two paths, a critical and a non-critical path. I'm choosing a pretty simple scenario over here, just so that we can think about it critically and simply over here. So in order to manage resources and to maintain progress on the critical path, will you delay the start of non-critical task by 7 days? And let's notice over here, non-critical task 1 actually has 8 days of float. So we are trying to delay the activity within its available float. So will you delay or not delay non-critical task 1? And Brian, can we have the poll up, please? Let's quickly choose a yes or a no. We'll have 10 seconds. Okay, so we can see about 63% people said yes, they will be willing to delay non-critical task 1 in this case. And 38% said they will not. So 2 out of 3 will delay, 1 out of 3 will not. Okay, let's move to the next question. Now we inherently know that these durations are uncertain. So knowing the uncertainty now on the critical path and on the non-critical path, how likely are you to delay non-critical task 1 by 7 days? And can we have the second question up now, Brian? So you can see that results at this point, maybe and definitely will delay is about 47%. So kind of still leaning towards delaying. And we have about 54% saying not likely and definitely not. So still pretty even in this case, kind of like a toss-up over here in this scenario. Okay. So now let's take a result. What happens statistically if we consider the uncertainty? Okay. So statistically, if we were to run a simulation on this model, even without a delay, the critical path and non-critical path are equally likely to become critical. We can see the critical path was critical 52% of the time, and the non-critical path was critical 54% of the time. And yes, the sum doesn't hold up to 100% because there were certain cases or certain scenarios where both paths might have been critical at the same time. So people who said, yeah, you would not delay, well, maybe you made a good selection or a good decision over there, because, well, you don't know. Non-critical path is equally as likely. So if you delay by 7 days, it is quite likely that you will delay the project. And the other premise that the total floats are based on the total duration of the project, which was 100 days. And if we notice over here, 100-day duration was only likely by 30%. So there was a 70% chance you were already going to overrun that duration. So kind of agrees with the previous poll that Dr. Yee had said, where people said, yeah, it was either 50-50 or lower where their probabilities are. However, if you did choose to delay non-critical task 1, well, in that case, now if we look at how often the paths were critical, and we see because of the delay, the non-critical path is now 5 times more likely to be critical. So we made a pretty significant impact on the project in this scenario. And again, if we look at the 100-day duration, from 30% likelihood, the likelihood has now dropped to 8% that we will finish within the 100-day duration that we have. So a pretty big impact on the likelihood itself. So we can see how uncertainty kind of comes into play into this decision making, and how basing the decision of floating or delaying an activity using total float might not be giving you the right answers at that point. Okay. And like Dr. Gee mentioned, the original concept, the theory behind it actually came out in 1995 when Gong and Roings discussed the joint influence of float use and uncertainty in your schedule on the non-critical activities and its impact on the project completion date. So they give out a conventional solution which gives an optimistic estimates of the project duration and the float available. And they give you a safe range of float use, which takes into consideration the uncertainty and risk in your schedule in order to avoid any schedule overrun. They also mention that safe float use could depend on project manager's risk appetite, but they don't really mention that in the paper, how that can play into the role. So depending on if the project manager is risk averse, they might want to be certain to 100%, whereas a risk taker could come down and say, okay, I'm okay with a 20% risk that I would overrun and be okay with that. Okay, so over here now I'm going to show kind of a theoretical approach on how you can calculate safe floats, but I will mention why this is a very limited approach. So the idea is pretty simple behind the calculation of safe float. So in this particular case, I'm using the same example, but instead of using a 100-day duration, which we saw was very unlikely to happen, we are now adding a 5-day contingency. So we are picking a later end date, let's say. So August 3rd is the latest, is the project end date by which we want the project done. Now, if we use the pessimistic durations for all the tasks, move those tasks to their late dates in that scenario, that gives you a start date for each task, by which if you start the activity, well, the uncertainty would not really impact the project end, because again, you have considered the worst possible scenario in that case. So we do that for non-critical task 2, which is 60-day duration now instead of the 48 in the original. So on the left, I have the original example. On the right, I am modifying it to have non-critical task 2 use its pessimistic duration and move to late start date. So when we move it to late start date, we get a start date for non-critical task 2 as June 5th. The original start date for non-critical task 2 was June 4th. And in the original scenario, the late start date was June 17th, considering the 13 days of available total float. So you can see total float says, okay, it's fine if non-critical task 2 gets delayed by 13 days. Whereas the safe start date of June 5 actually says, well, you just have 1 day of float available on it. And if you start by 6/5, you should be fine. We can use the same process to do on non-critical task 1. Just in this case, we will use the pessimistic durations on both non-critical task 1 and task 2. And over here, we come up with a safe float use for non-critical task 1 is -15 days. So we are saying, in order to avoid any impact on project end, non-critical task 1 should have started by April 6th. However, we were going to start it on April 21st. So we are already too late by 15 days in this case. So at this point, it is likely that if you put in any delay on non-critical task 1, it will delay the project end date. Similar thing for critical path activity. We have a safe float use of -6 days, and compare this -6 days to the -15 days on non-critical task 1. Well, non-critical task 1 is actually more critical than the critical path we are seeing because of the inherent uncertainty in the tasks. And again, any delay on the critical path will likely delay the project end, can likely have a delay on the project end. And again, consider this, that we can do this approach of using the pessimistic durations, pushing everything on late start and building the worst possible scenario. Well, you can do that, but the problem with this theoretical approach is that it always gives you that guaranteed safe float. So guaranteed safe float being that, yeah, everything is the worst case possible, but how often does that happen either, right? That all the activities are always on their pessimistic durations. Well, it can happen. There is maybe a 0.001% chance of that happening in a 200 activity schedule or a 2000 activity schedule, but I wouldn't say that's very likely. So the theoretical approach does do that. It gives you that 100% level, that there is absolutely 100% guarantee that if you remain within these duration ranges, and if you use these dates, you will not be delayed. So net risk, on the other side, provides you with an approach which is a little more optimized. It takes care of these very low probabilities at the get-go, and it provides you somewhat of a 99% plus likelihood by default. And again, because it's using a simulation-based approach, it can take into consideration things like risks that might be happening, uncertain risks. So if a risk that occurs 5% of the time, but has a 100-day impact, well, really considering that in the theoretical approach, if we always add a 100-day impact and use that as the pessimistic duration, then, well, you have really impacted the overall schedule. The project might no longer be feasible at all if you do that. Along with that, you can take into consideration correlations, different types of calendars, many other things that you are pretty used to in a risk model. And again, being a simulation-based approach, it can take into consideration the PM's risk appetite. So if the PM is willing to take a little risk, over here in the table, if we see, if the PM was a risk-averse person, then they would go for the 100% likelihood. And in that particular case, task 1 had minus 16 days of safe float. So they would want to shift task 1 earlier by 16 days. They have to recover those 16 days somewhere to start the activity earlier. However, if I was willing to take some risk, let's say just 5% chance that it will be over, and at 95% guarantee, we are down to minus 10 days. We are getting a higher safe float in this case, but negative. So minus 10 days of safe float. So we have saved 6 days, which could be a significant cost impact because now you have to only consider moving the activity earlier by 10 days. On task 2, originally we had in the 100% case 6 days. With the 95% chance, you have 9 days. So again, we can see how managing risk can be a part of it. And depending on how much risk the PM is willing to take, you can vary the amount of safe float that's available to the project. Okay. And over here, I'm showing a schedule for a case study we did on a food processing facility. We can see the critical path in red over here, which goes through the bed award, steel, and shops RNA delivery activities up here, and then to seal joist decking, pouring and sealing of decks, power lighting, MEP process equipment, and installing and connecting of the equipment. This is an 11-month schedule. And in this particular case, if we look at the completion date curve, well, we see the ever so familiar case that the deterministic plan of August 27, a finish date of August 27 is 0% likely. There is absolutely no chance that we are finishing by that date. So let's add in some contingency, make it a P80 date, and let's say the project end date will be October 2. So on an 11-month project, we have added about a 6-week contingency to say our project will end October 2nd, and that's our project end date. So using that project end date, we calculated safe floats using NetRest. And over here, now we can see the safe floats overlaid with the red tasks showing activities that have absolutely no safe float. The safe float was either 0 or negative. Yellow or the orange ones kind of show activities that have some positive safe float, but it is limited. And the green tasks actually are those, well, they have pretty much all the float you can use. So each time, if you use all the available float that they have at the moment, it should be fine. They should not impact the project end date. And over here, we see how bid award, steel, and shops RNA delivery are those kinds of activities. Well, their path just doesn't have enough uncertainty to say that they will impact the project. However, the deterministic critical path said these were really critical tasks. So now we can go through certain scenarios on how decisions can be made with safe float. So let's say due to delays, the project team has used up 15 days of available total float on building permits. Is the project likely delayed? And we can see in this deterministic scenario, we had 17 days of float on building permit activity. So if we were using total float, the activity was non-critical originally. It had deterministic float of 17 days. So because we are only delaying by 15 days, delayed within float, and the project is not delayed. And because we are not delaying the project, there is really no mitigation necessary. However, if you're using safe float instead, the safe start date for that task is December 3rd, even though the deterministic start date is December 5. So it really has a safe float of -2 days. So as long as while executing the project, if we start earlier than December 3rd, there is a 0% chance that the project will go beyond the P80 date. But if the delay has caused the activity to start beyond December 3rd, then the project is likely delayed and we should start considering mitigation scenarios for it. And again, over here, we also see the benefit of using safe float. Well, total float was saying, well, you can delay building permit. So again, it's a 60-day test right now, which could be extended because of uncertainty. So at least 2 months later, you will realize whether we are delayed or not. But if we are using safe float right at the start of where the delay happened, we can tell you, well, should mitigation measures be necessary in this particular scenario because we have gone past the safe start date. So it gives you an early indication compared to total float. Next, in the base case schedule, are certain activities starting too late? And well, if we were using total float, because we added schedule contingency, every activity has float greater than 0. So no activities are starting too late. Whereas we can use safe float concepts though, and anything starting beyond the safe start date is starting too late. And so you can mitigate the deterministic schedule early on to say, yes, can I move these tasks earlier? Can I parallelize some work so that these tasks start earlier? Some mitigation measure to take on these 8 tasks that do happen to start too late according to the deterministic schedule.
We don't want to change what he's doing.
Yeah. Okay, and when you're considering resource profile, managing resources, would you prioritize between 2 tasks? How will you prioritize? So over here, I'm taking 2 fabrication activities, an electrical equipment fabrication or an elevator fabrication. And we see electrical equipment fabrication has 20 days of float, whereas elevator fabrication has 28 days. Well, total float says delay elevator fabrication. But be careful over here, because these total floats are based on deterministic durations, one set of durations. And we all understand this, how easy it is to manipulate float availability in a schedule. We can use all optimistic durations and we have a ton of float on the path. We can use all pessimistic durations and there is absolutely no float in the path. So using total float just for prioritization might not be the best scenario. Well, if we look at safe float though, which takes uncertainty into consideration, electrical equipment fabrication has 0 days of safe float, so it cannot be delayed. Whereas elevator fabrication has 14 days. And so we can make a decision with greater confidence that we can go ahead with delaying of elevator fabrication. Okay, at this time, I'll give this back over to Dr. Gee for some takeaways.
We have safe float as a counterpart to total float. And it's an improved value of schedule leeway because it is considering remaining uncertainty and risks with all paths. But the really striking revelation of float risk assessment is that we can actually determine whether early start dates are actually too late. And this is sort of a new concept that we become aware of if you accept duration variability. And as Dr. Vivek mentioned, when you simulate your schedule and you come up with some negative safe floats, which means that your early starts are too late, then you're going to have to change your logic, crash activities, and get back to where your early start indeed is not late. So that's this is kind of a really a useful byproduct. Every schedule, really, every early schedule that you have, if it's not simulated, it's questionable whether those early dates are really valid. So on the one hand, if you do not risk assess your schedule, your safe start date is your late start date, but as we're shown, that really isn't necessarily so. If you really want a safe start date, a late start that is safe, then you have to risk assess your schedule. You have to target a p-value completion date, and you're much better shape. Now, if you have a detailed schedule, let's say 5,000 activities, and you're going to risk assess it with your stakeholders, there is no way that you're going to walk into a room with a 5,000 activity schedule. So what do you typically do? You summarize that into a base case model, 5,000 activities, maybe you have 300 activities. That's the schedule that you range durations, that you have a risk matrix developed and that you simulate. But the safe floats that you calculate when you simulate your summary schedule, they don't transfer back to your detailed schedule. At least we haven't figured that out yet. We'll work on that one of these days in due time. But so if you want to take advantage of safe float nowadays, and you are strictly on CPM software, then you would have to, it's 6 months down the road, if your model has changed, if your detailed schedule has changed as to logic, then you're gonna have to summarize it again, run a risk assessment. Well, that is DOA. There is no way that you're gonna be doing that every few months manually. However, if you do have access to our latest software offering, Summit, you can density zoom out your schedule at any point in time using some kind of a summary coding scheme or your work breakdown structure. You can actually zoom it back out to your original base case model and see whether or not your projected start dates are still safe or not, or you can simulate it again based on the remaining uncertainty, where your data has advanced. So safe float, in order for you to be able to have safe float, to calculate them, to use them effectively, you're going to have net risk and Summit, and then be able to do it. Fortunately, we have both, and Sevi will be presenting Summit tomorrow, and I think you find it pretty exciting. All right, so now to totally wrap this up, because total floats are based from an unreliable, overly optimistic finish date, you better have some real contingency on your schedule. If your forward pass gives you 20 months, you better have another 2 months or 3 months to your required completion date. This is just a rule of thumb. If you don't simulate the schedule, well, it's just a rule of thumb. Most people would say 10 to 15% contingency, people call it buffer, schedule reserve, ought to be, is reasonable. We have a client that requires 20% contingency from you projected finish date to the required project completion date. Obviously, if you do a risk assessment, then you have an objective way to figure out how much contingency you do have. We leave too much on the table when you simulate a schedule and you choose not to assess float use risk. If you're using net risk, it's right there, low-hanging fruit. And we believe, we're projecting at this point, that the combination of total flows and safe flows should greatly improve our chances to completing our projects on time, much better than before. That said, we've just programmed safe float into net risk. We're just about to start projects where we are going to be simulating them, the schedules, having safe flows. Looking back, 2 to 3 years from today, we're hoping to be sharing what we're learning on safe float, but we know it's going to make a huge difference. And one of the areas that we envision like a huge difference is in forensic schedule analysis. This is going to have a huge impact on that. Thank you very much, and we look forward to some questions.
Thanks, Dr. Gee and Dr. Vivek. Great presentation on Safe Float. We do have some questions that I'll read off to you, and then you can decide which one of you would like to answer them. The first one comes from Jillian. How will Safe Float use impact schedule delay analysis?
Well, I kind of just sort of hinted at that. I think we're back to the drawing board. In reality, if all parties to a contract, the contractor, the owner, the subcontractors want to have an honest assessment of how delay impacts your project, you will want to simulate your schedule. You want to know you say starts. You want to make sure you have safe starts. And like Dr. Vivek pointed out, relying on critical path delays when there's little uncertainty on the critical path, it's not the best solution. The best solution is looking at how delay may impact your p-value and your completion date. So I think that it's going to take us quite a while to figure this out, to have some cases where this is affirmed, and then we'll be in a whole new generation of schedule delay analysis at that point.
Great. Okay. So next question. So there are many factors leading to late projects. What impact will Safe Float have on delivering projects on time?
Dr. Vivek, would you like to try this, or you'd like me to try it?
Go ahead.
Okay, so again, first of all, if you want to use Safe Float, you're going to have to risk assess your schedule. I mean, I have no clue. I wish I knew, I guess, out of 100 projects in the world, how many of those are risk assessed? Total float is a very myopic view of schedule leeway, very myopic. It is a 66-year-old concept. Come on. Safe Float is brand new, and it takes advantage of risk on your schedule. So I think that if we start to use total float month by month, occasionally we get safe floats, then you realize you are impacting your p-value, you are breaching safe starts, you're going to be required to accelerate your schedule, to crash it, to change logic, because the chances are you're already falling behind. So Safe Float is going to allow you to do this objectively versus just relying on one scenario.
Next question comes from Besher. So the question is, limited Safe Float activities seem to be similar to what we used to call in the Middle East as near critical activities. And we define them as activities with total float of less than 2 weeks. Are these two concepts the same? Not really.
And Dr. Vivek can chime in too, but Safe Float is based on duration uncertainty. It's based on risk. Near critical activity is still based on one scenario. Safe Float is based on every possible scenario on your schedule.
Yeah, so considering Safe Float being similar to total float, but taking into consideration the uncertainty, well, in that case, yes, the orange activities were kind of like near critical, but near critical based on Safe Float rather than just the float available, the deterministic float.
Right.
So next question, does this stochastic approach always generate results that model a normal distribution? And that's from Gerald Rosario.
I can take that one. So not necessarily. So consider cases where you might have certain risk impacts which end up creating bimodal distributions for completion dates for projects. So the simulation kind of will take that into account, those kinds of risks, and actually generate bimodal distributions in those scenarios, if that's what you were referring to. So no, it does not always base it off normal distributions. It is the distribution which will come out from the simulation that will be taken into consideration for the Safe Float calculations.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Hatim. How to change the general attitude in this industry from relying on total float to Safe Float?
Well, I think, Dr. Vivek, you might chime in too, but I think that we're going to have to perform some projects using both total and safe float, you're going to have a case where you only doing total float on that project. You're going to have a similar project where you're doing both total and safe float. You're going to wait 2 to 3 years to go by. You're going to have your results. And once we start to see that we are completing projects on time when we use safe float, then the profession will start to change. But it's going to be a little while.
Okay, I got one more from Eric. Would you recommend a regular update, say monthly, to safe float analysis, less frequently, or only after a major risk event occurs?
Well, certainly, if you have Summit, because otherwise it's prohibitively, if you got to do it manually. If you have Summit, I would say a quarterly revisit of your safe flow, safe start circulation, is what I would recommend. Now, also, if you do have a major delay, a major risk that materializes, absolutely, that would be the time to re-simulate your risk and refigure out your safe start, safe flows. Excellent question.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, there's one more from Richard. On some of our major projects, clients are asking how confident that the project date will be met. By using safe float, can we guarantee project completion to clients? What are the risks if it is not met?
Well, if your duration uncertainty is developed with good methods, and there are all kinds of methods to do that now, and if your risks are properly ascertained, and if you do this periodically based on Eric's question, I would say that your chances are, huge. In my prediction, we got to do some projects and prove that to be a reality. But I think you're orders of magnitude ahead of the game.
Thank you. Okay, so that completes our questions.